My husband abandoned me halfway through my cancer treatment because his ex called crying that she needed emotional support after her boyfriend left her, and when I begged him not to go during the worst week of my treatment, he told me his ex was more fragile than me and that I was strong enough to handle this alone, so I called his mother and mine, and now his entire family has disowned him. I'm writing this from my hospital bed, and I'm still processing everything that's happened in the past 3 weeks. My name is Rachel, I'm 34, and 6 months ago I was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer. Until recently, I thought my husband David and I were facing this battle together. I was wrong. David and I have been married for 7 years, together for 10. When I got my diagnosis, he held me while I cried and promised we'd get through this together. He came to all my initial appointments, learned about my treatment plan, and seemed genuinely supportive. He even took time off work to drive me to my first few chemo sessions. The first month of treatment was hard but manageable. David was attentive, bringing me ginger tea for nausea, holding my hand during the rough days, and doing his best to keep my spirits up. I felt like we were handling this crisis the way married couples should, as a team. Then his ex-girlfriend Stephanie came back into the picture. David and Stephanie dated for 3 years in college and stayed friends after their breakup. I'd always been uncomfortable with their friendship, but David insisted it was purely platonic and that I was being insecure. They texted occasionally and would catch up maybe twice a year when she was in town. It bothered me, but I tried to be the cool wife who didn't get jealous over her husband's female friends. 3 months into my treatment, Stephanie's long-term relationship ended badly. Her boyfriend of 5 years left her for someone else, and she was devastated. She started calling David constantly, crying about her heartbreak and asking him for emotional support. At first, these calls were maybe once a week for an hour or two. Then they became daily occurrences. I was in the middle of my most intensive chemo cycle, dealing with severe nausea, fatigue, and the emotional weight of watching my body change in ways I'd never imagined. My hair had fallen out, I'd lost 20 pounds, and some days I could barely get out of bed. David's attention was increasingly divided between caring for me and comforting Stephanie. The calls started happening during my chemo sessions. David would excuse himself to take her calls, leaving me alone in the treatment center while he talked her through whatever crisis she was having that day. When I asked him to please keep his phone on silent during my treatments, he said Stephanie was in a really dark place and he was worried about her mental health. I tried to be understanding. I knew heartbreak was painful, and I didn't want to be the kind of person who prevented her husband from helping a friend in need. But I was fighting for my life, and I needed him to fight with me. 2 weeks ago, things came to a head. I was scheduled for my most aggressive chemo treatment yet, a 3-day hospital stay where they'd pump me full of drugs that would essentially destroy my immune system before building it back up. My oncologist warned us that this would be the hardest part of my treatment, and that I'd need constant care and monitoring. The night before I was supposed to be admitted, Stephanie called David sobbing. Her ex-boyfriend was getting married to the woman he'd left her for, and she'd just seen the engagement announcement on social media. She was having what she called a complete breakdown and begged David to come over because she was afraid of what she might do to herself. David told me he had to go to her. I reminded him that I was being admitted to the hospital in the morning for the most dangerous part of my treatment. I told him I was scared and needed him there with me. His response will haunt me forever. Rachel, you're stronger than she is. Stephanie is more fragile, and she's been through so much trauma. You can handle this, she can't. He left at 11 p.m. to go comfort his ex-girlfriend, promising he'd be back in time to take me to the hospital. He never came back. I called him at 7 a.m. when I needed to leave for the hospital. He said he was still with Stephanie, that she'd had a panic attack and he couldn't leave her alone. He said he'd try to come by the hospital later, but Stephanie needed him more than I did right now. I drove myself to the hospital that morning. I checked myself in alone, filled out the paperwork alone, and spent the first day of the most brutal treatment of my life completely alone while my husband comforted another woman. David did show up that evening, but only for an hour. He said Stephanie was staying at his place because she couldn't bear to be alone in her apartment with all the memories. When I asked where that left me when I got discharged, he said we'd figure it out. The next 2 days were hell. The chemo made me sicker than I'd ever been in my life. I was vomiting constantly, my fever spiked dangerously high, and I developed an infection that required additional treatment. Through it all, David would pop in for brief visits between rushing back to take care of Stephanie. On the 3rd day, I developed complications that landed me in the ICU. My white blood cell count had dropped to dangerous levels, and I was at serious risk of sepsis. When the nurses asked where my emergency contact was, I had to tell them my husband was busy with another woman. That's when I decided I'd had enough. From my ICU bed, I called David's mother, Linda. Linda and I have always had a good relationship, and she'd been checking on me regularly throughout my treatment. When she answered, I told her exactly where her son was and why he wasn't at the hospital with his wife who was fighting for her life. Linda was silent for a long moment, then said, "Rachel, honey, are you telling me that David is with another woman while you're in the ICU?" I explained the whole situation, how Stephanie had been calling constantly, how David had chosen to comfort her instead of being with me during treatment, how he told me his ex-girlfriend was more fragile than his wife with cancer. Linda was furious. She said she was driving to the hospital immediately and that she'd handled David. She also said she was calling my mother, because someone needed to be advocating for me while I was too sick to advocate for myself. Within 2 hours, both our mothers were at the hospital. Linda had called David and told him to get to the hospital immediately or he'd be hearing from her lawyer about abandonment. My mother was holding my hand and crying, asking how I'd been going through this alone. When David finally showed up, the confrontation was explosive. Linda didn't even give him a chance to explain. She told him he was a disgrace to their family and that she was ashamed to call him her son. She said that in 34 years, she'd never seen him do anything as selfish and cruel as abandoning his sick wife for another woman. David tried to defend himself, saying Stephanie was suicidal and he was afraid she'd hurt herself. Linda cut him off and said, "Your wife was in the ICU with sepsis while you were playing house with your ex-girlfriend. Rachel could have died, and you weren't here." My mother, who's normally very reserved, told David that if he ever came near me again while I was this vulnerable, she'd make sure everyone in town knew what kind of man he really was. David left that night, and I haven't seen him since. Linda and my mother have been taking turns staying with me, and my sister flew in from across the country to help with my care. Update 1. It's been a week since the ICU incident, and the fallout has been swift and brutal for David. I'm out of the hospital now and staying with my parents while I recover, which has given me some perspective on everything that's happened. Linda followed through on her threats. She called David's entire family and told them exactly what he'd done. His father, who I've always respected as a man of integrity, called me personally to apologize for his son's behavior and to tell me that David was no longer welcome at family gatherings. His 2 sisters have also reached out to express their disgust and support for me. Apparently, the family confrontation was devastating for David. Linda told me that when she explained to David's father what had happened, he said he didn't recognize the man his son had become. David's grandfather, who's been married for 60 years and is the family patriarch, reportedly said that David had dishonored the family name by abandoning his wife during her illness. But the real shock came when Linda did some investigating into Stephanie's situation. It turns out that Stephanie's breakdown wasn't quite what it seemed. Linda reached out to some mutual acquaintances and discovered that Stephanie had been posting on social media throughout the week I was in the hospital, posting photos of herself and David at restaurants, at movies, and even at a spa day she'd treated him to for being such a good friend. When Linda showed me the screenshots, I felt sick all over again. While I was fighting for my life in the ICU, David and Stephanie were living it up like they were on a romantic getaway. The photos showed them laughing, holding hands, and looking very much like a couple. In one photo, Stephanie had captioned it, "So grateful for this amazing man who's helping me heal." Linda confronted David with these photos, and apparently he broke down and admitted that things with Stephanie had gotten complicated. He claimed it had just happened naturally while he was comforting her, and that he hadn't meant for it to become romantic. That's when Linda dropped the bombshell. She told David she was not only cutting him off financially, she'd been helping with our mortgage payments during my treatment, but she was also transferring the money she'd been planning to give us to my medical fund instead. She said that if David wanted to abandon his wife for another woman, he could figure out how to support himself. My mother, meanwhile, has been a force of nature. She's a retired teacher with a large network of friends in our community, and word has spread quickly about what David did. Apparently, several people have approached my mother at the grocery store and other places to express their shock and support for me. The most unexpected development came yesterday. Stephanie's parents, who are quite wealthy and prominent in David's social circle, reached out to Linda asking to meet with me. Apparently, they had no idea what their daughter had been doing and were horrified when they learned that she'd essentially stolen a woman's husband during cancer treatment. Update 2. The meeting with Stephanie's parents yesterday was surreal and unexpectedly healing. Martha and Robert, Stephanie's parents, came to my parents' house and spent 2 hours apologizing for their daughter's behavior and asking how they could help make things right. It turns out that Stephanie had been lying to them about the situation. She told them that David was a friend from college who was helping her through her breakup, and that he was separated from his wife. They had no idea that David was married to a woman currently undergoing cancer treatment, or that he'd abandoned me during the most critical part of my care. Martha was in tears as she explained that they'd raised Stephanie better than this, and that they were ashamed of what she'd done. Robert, who's a successful businessman, was more direct. He said that what Stephanie and David had done was morally reprehensible and that they wanted to find a way to support my recovery since their daughter had contributed to disrupting it. They asked if they could contribute to my medical expenses as a way of making amends for their daughter's role in what happened. When I protested that it wasn't their responsibility, Martha said, We raised the woman who helped destroy your support system during the fight of your life. We absolutely have a responsibility here. They ended up writing a check for $15,000 toward my medical bills and setting up a fund that they're encouraging their friends and social circle to contribute to. Apparently, word has spread among their wealthy friends about what happened, and the response has been overwhelming. Robert also told me something that gave me a sense of justice I didn't know I needed. He said that Stephanie's actions had completely destroyed her reputation in their social circle. Many of their friends are married couples who were horrified by the idea of someone pursuing a married man while his wife was fighting cancer. Several people have cut ties with Stephanie entirely. Martha mentioned that they'd had a confrontation with Stephanie about the situation, and that she'd tried to justify her actions by claiming that David's marriage was already over and that she was just helping him realize he deserved better. When they pointed out that he was married to a woman with cancer, Stephanie reportedly said, "Well, she's probably going to die anyway, so I was just helping him move on." The fact that she could say something so callous about another human being's life made even her own parents realize that they didn't know their daughter as well as they thought they did. Meanwhile, David has been trying to contact me through various means. He's sent flowers, letters, and even had a mutual friend reach out saying he wants to explain himself. I've ignored all of it. My focus right now is on my health and recovery, not on managing his guilt or regret. My oncologist says I'm responding well to treatment despite the stress of everything that's happened. The support I've received from both families, minus David and Stephanie, my friends, and even strangers has been overwhelming. The fund that Stephanie's parents started has grown to over $30,000, and people are still contributing. Update 3. 3 weeks have passed, and I wanted to update everyone on the continued fallout from this situation. The community response has been both heartwarming and devastating for David and Stephanie. The fund started by Stephanie's parents has now reached $50,000, with contributions coming from people I've never even met. Apparently, the story has spread throughout our town and surrounding areas, and people have been moved to help. A local news station even picked up the story, with my permission, as part of a piece about community support for cancer patients. David's professional life has also been affected. He works for a mid-size company where several employees know our story through various connections. His boss, who's a family friend of my parents, called to check on me personally and mentioned that David's behavior had raised questions about his character and judgment at work. Stephanie, meanwhile, has been dealing with her own consequences. Her parents told me that several of her friends have distanced themselves from her, and she's been asked to resign from a charity board she served on when the other members learned about her role in this situation. But the most significant development happened last week when David finally cornered me at my oncologist's office. He'd been waiting in the parking lot and approached me as I was leaving my appointment. He looked terrible, like he hadn't been sleeping or taking care of himself. He immediately started apologizing and begging for a chance to explain. He said that being with Stephanie had been a mistake born out of stress and confusion about my illness. He claimed that seeing me sick had made him feel helpless and scared, and that comforting Stephanie had felt easier than facing the possibility of losing me. I listened to his entire speech without saying a word. When he finished, I told him that his explanation actually made everything worse. I said that if he'd abandoned me because he couldn't handle watching me be sick, then he'd never actually loved me, he'd loved the idea of me when I was healthy and convenient. I told him that a real partner shows up during the hard times, not runs away to play house with an ex-girlfriend. I said that his actions had shown me exactly who he was when things got difficult, and that I could never trust him again. David broke down crying and said he'd been going to therapy and realized how wrong he'd been. He begged me to consider counseling together and said he'd do anything to make things right. That's when I told him about the divorce papers I'd filed the previous week. Final update. 6 months have passed since David abandoned me during chemo, and I wanted to give a final update on how everything turned out. The divorce was finalized last month. David didn't contest anything, which I think was his way of trying to show remorse. I kept the house, and between the settlement and the community fund, I'm financially stable despite the medical bills. My cancer treatment was successful. I finished my final chemo session 3 months ago, and my recent scans show no evidence of disease. My oncologist says my prognosis is excellent, and while I'll need regular monitoring, I'm officially in remission. David and Stephanie's relationship fell apart spectacularly about 2 months after my confrontation with him. Apparently, once the excitement of their secret affair wore off and they had to deal with the real-world consequences of their actions, they realized they weren't compatible. Stephanie moved back to her hometown after the breakup, unable to handle the social isolation she'd created for herself here. David has tried to reach out a few times since their breakup, but I've maintained no contact. His mother Linda still checks on me regularly and has become like a second mother to me. She's told me that David is in therapy and seems to be genuinely trying to understand why he made such devastating choices, but she's also made it clear that she supports my decision to divorce him. The most beautiful part of this whole terrible experience has been discovering how much love and support exists in my community. The fund that started as Stephanie's parents' attempt to make amends grew into something much larger, a demonstration of how people can come together to support someone in crisis. I've used part of the money to start a support group for cancer patients whose relationships were affected by their diagnosis. It turns out there are more of us than I realized, people whose partners couldn't handle the reality of serious illness and either left entirely or emotionally checked out during treatment. I'm also in a new relationship now. His name is Michael, and I met him through my support group. He's a survivor himself who went through treatment 2 years ago. He understands the fear, the physical changes, and the emotional toll in ways that David never could have. More importantly, he's shown me what it looks like when someone chooses to love you through difficulty rather than despite it. What David did to me was unforgivable, but it also freed me from a marriage with someone who didn't understand what in sickness and in health actually means. I learned that I'm stronger than I ever knew, and that the right people will show up for you when it matters most. To anyone going through a serious illness, you deserve people in your life who see your strength, not just your vulnerability. You deserve partners who step up during crisis, not run away from it. And if someone abandons you during your darkest hour, they were never worthy of your light in the first place. As for David and Stephanie, I don't wish them harm, but I don't wish them well either. They made choices that revealed their true characters, and they'll have to live with the consequences of those choices. I'm too busy living my best life to waste energy thinking about theirs. Sometimes the worst betrayals lead to the best revelations about who you really are and what you're truly capable of surviving. I survived cancer, and I survived David. Everything else feels manageable in comparison.